How is it going, my friends? Shalom, shalom, and welcome to this episode of The Watchdog, exclusively on the Synagogue YouTube channel. I am your host, CJ Cox, and we got some interesting stories to be going through today. Want to, of course, give a little bit of time for everybody to show up, so I'm going to just kind of ramble here for a minute. For those of you who are already here, please do hit that like and, of course, share this to your different social media platforms so that we can get this message out to the masses. What point is there in having a message if there is nobody to hear it, right? And subscribe, of course, if you have not done so. These watchdogs are posted Monday, Wednesday, Fridays, my news podcast or news show or political punditry, whatever you want to call it. And I also have a apologetics, faith-based podcast that I have, and we do that on Saturdays and Sundays, light version being on Sundays. So if you guys are interested in any of that stuff, definitely do check that out. I would greatly appreciate it. So got some very interesting things here today. As you can see from the headliner, there's been some talk about the potential resignation of Pope Francis. So we're going to get into a little bit of that today. I'm going to try to address a little bit more about UN denuclearization, and we are also going to be talking a lot about the dissolution of Israel's recent unity government, right? That we've been talking about how they had this government set up where basically the Benny Gantz party, known as Blue and White, as well as the Likud, who is, of course, led by Benjamin Netanyahu, came to an agreement where they would form a unity government with each other rather than being opposed. And one of the parts of that agreement, of course, that we had referenced numerous times was that they were going to be basically going back and forth every year and 6 months on the prime ministership. Now, this is actually now going to occur before Benny Gantz ever actually got the opportunity to be the prime minister. And whether or not there's any foul play involved there, I guess nobody really knows but God. And, of course, the people involved. But nonetheless, these are all the different topics we're going to get into today. So definitely have a lot of interesting things to address. But, of course, before we do that, we're going to have a talk about some things that aren't necessarily as big per se. Right? Our little, our little pre-article discussion, if you will. Right? And I got a couple different topics I want to briefly address apart from the articles that we're reading today. So the first thing that I did want to address was there is this subject that we talk a lot about, and by we, I mean, of course, me, as well as virtually everybody else who is involved, not only in conservative circles, but in libertarian circles and in a lot of far left circles even, and a lot of independent circles, a lot of people who basically have anything that differs from the status quo. And the reason why we all talk about this is because we're all experiencing it. And that is the big tech crackdown on what they prefer and what they do not prefer and what they consider to be acceptable speech and what they do not consider to be acceptable speech. It is obviously the case that as a free enterprise, right, as the owners of these domains, they absolutely have full reign to decide what is and is not on their platforms. And from the conservative point of view, there isn't really nothing as far as like nationalizing it that I think is necessary or would be good, right? So real quick, before anybody starts to have those kinds of ideas, I do want to say that's not a conservative view. That's not a constitutionalist view. That's not the kind of view that our founders would have had. And I do think that that's an incredibly important thing. They would have approached this in a way that either try to, go about it, some other different legal way that didn't actually infringe upon these companies' right to free enterprise, or, do something that was through the market itself, right? Which is what I would personally prefer. And that actually gets me to what I'm talking about, right? I do think that we have a solution completely separated from the United States government to this problem. And I know a lot of people are unwilling to actually explore these different platforms, specifically people outside of the conservative movement, but that's how we solve this problem. And here I basically revealed it. So let's just say it. We need to use different free speech alternatives, right? That doesn't mean we necessarily stop using these other ones, right? We can stay on here as long as they'll have us. But we need to actually get on these free speech alternatives so that they actually are, able to produce a more high quality product for us, namely the streaming service itself, and so that we actually have the capabilities of getting our messages out there and not putting all of our eggs in one basket. I mean, how terrible would it be if you had no backup and you didn't post all your stuff to any of your other social medias or anything like that? You just had it on, YouTube, for example, and then YouTube struck your channel down and now all your content's gone. I mean, that sucks, right? You can't get that back. And this isn't something that is only a problem for conservatives and Christians. I would just point out there are many libertarians like Adam Kokesh, for example, who are constantly being censored by big tech. There are numerous people on the far left, like the Raging Atheist, Jimmy Dore, for example. Not the Raging Atheist is not Jimmy Dore, but the Raging Atheist and Jimmy Dore, right? Who are being censored by big tech. There are numerous people who would consider themselves to be independent, like Tim Pool, right? Who have a lot of problems with big tech. There are a lot of people who are completely and totally uninvolved in politics, like Matt Pat, who makes video game theories, right? Or PewDiePie, who just, I don't even know what PewDiePie does. He just does random things on YouTube and gets 100 million subscribers somehow, right? Even they end up running into these problems because that's the whole thing about YouTube censorship. It doesn't just come, and not just YouTube censorship, but any censorship, whether it's big tech or the mainstream media or the government, right? They don't just come for one person. They end up coming for everybody who they don't like. And they may not like you because of the words you use or because of something you said on your social media 6 years ago or because they just don't really enjoy your content, right? It really doesn't matter what the reason is. They have the power to do it. And we shouldn't make this a political issue. We shouldn't describe things like Parler and Rumble, right, as conservative Twitter, as conservative YouTube, right? They are free speech alternatives. And the only way that they're going to stay afloat and not become echo chambers is if they end up being used by all of the different people who are being impacted by big tech. And that does include the libertarian crowd. And that does include the socialist crowd. And that does include the atheist crowd and the Muslim crowd, right? And so on and so forth, right? Let's actually use these platforms. There's no reason for, and also let me just point out, it is amazing how so many of these people who are constantly getting into fights with the mob, right? Who refuse to capitulate to the mob on so many different things, then they get really scared when it comes to political things. I do just want to point that out. It's sort of a side tangent, but it is amazing to me that so many of these YouTubers that are, apolitical, the Matt Pats, the Shane Dawsons, the Tana Mojos, so on and so forth of the world, that they are so overwhelmingly liberal because it is the liberals who have been coming after them for their entire careers. But I digress on that. The point is, this shouldn't be a political issue. Use free speech platforms. I'm not saying you necessarily need to leave the other platforms, right? Let's use them as long as they'll have us. But get on Parler, get on Rumble, get on Library, BitChute, Minds, right? Let's see what becomes what. So far, it kind of looks like Rumble's going to operate as a YouTube equivalent. Minds is going to operate as a Facebook equivalent. And Parler might operate as the Twitter equivalent, with BitChute and Gab kind of looking like they're going to go to the wayside, really. And I think Library is going to primarily be used as like a safe haven to sort of like lock everything up. That's my own personal prediction, though, so we'll see what happens there. Nonetheless, use these platforms. That's all I'm saying. Use them, right? We have a capitalistic system where it is in our hands to change these things, right? Vote with your dollar, vote with your view, all that sort of stuff, right? You have the power to do that. So do it. And that's all I'm saying. So that's the first thing I wanted to talk about. Second thing I wanted to talk about, Pope Francis. Man, just gotta love all of the gifts Pope Francis gives us. I actually am not even being sarcastic when I say that, because Pope Francis so obviously proves that the Vatican is not the infallible body of Christ and that the Pope is not the supreme pontiff and leader of all Christians, right? I mean, more so than any pope in recent memory, in my personal opinion, right? Martin Luther's Pope, Urban II, is certainly one who comes to mind, but that was 500 years ago, right? So Francis, and I'm not going to show you any images or anything like that because they are obscene, has 2 or 3 times now, at least twice, but potentially 3 times, gone on Instagram, or at least people have used the Franciscus Instagram account to like very erotic and just, shall we say, and call them what they are, sexual models' pictures, Italian models, right? You heard that correctly. The Supreme Pontiff is going around using the papal Instagram, right, to like sexualized young girls in their 20s, maybe late teens, so on and so forth. Now, obviously, the people have pointed out he's probably not directly using his Instagram, and that's obviously probably a little bit true, although who knows, right? The thing is, okay, number one, if the guy just had an issue, right, that would be one thing, right? Obviously, we are people who, as Christians, I mean, right, of grace, right? We obviously come to repentance, get that under the blood. Christ can save you from those things. Now, granted, I don't think Catholics are Christians, right? I think you need to leave that papal system and come to Christianity. But this, not to get on a theology rant. This isn't the unapologetics, right? Point being, if it was just something like that, this criticism would not come out, right? But what it is a persistent and public affirmation of intensely sexualized models, right? Like I said, 2 or 3 times now. And the Pope himself has not come out and actually said anything against these things or fired anybody who may or may not be going out and using his papal Instagram profile to support these people. And in fact, these models have even started to use Pope Francis's likes as a marketing technique, blessed by the Holy Father and so on and so forth, right? And yet Pope Francis refuses to do anything about it. Right? He has not come out and made any sort of public declaration saying that this is not me, I don't affirm this, anything like that, right? He's not gotten rid of whoever it is that's doing this. He's not gone to these pictures and unliked them or had somebody do so, or publicly said, no, I do not actually affirm the sexualized, perverted, degrading nature of these girls' works, and I hope that they find repentance from it and also salvation from it, because it is degrading to them just as much as it is degrading to anybody else who listens to it. He refuses to do any of that stuff. And this is on top of the fact, it's not just the fact that the Pope is liking barely clothed girls on Instagram. This is on top of the fact that the Pope has now also signed a deal for his book to be turned into a movie or docuseries or something like that. With Netflix. Yes, Netflix, who pushes the pedophilic propaganda, Big Mouth, and Cuties. Netflix, who pushed the propaganda, the 2 popes, which shamed not only traditionalist Catholics, but of course, the conservative interpretation of Scripture. By the way, the guy who directed the 2 popes will be working on this project. The same Netflix who just recently on their Instagram page posted, "Hail Satan." Not a joke. You can go find that for yourself. And by the way, if somebody sees this in the future and they've deleted that, you can find it on Taylor Marshall's YouTube channel, where he is actually shown because Taylor Marshall, he's a Roman Catholic, but he's a Roman Catholic who's very opposed to the progressivism of Pope Francis. I'll get to that later. But nonetheless, the point being, right, Hail Satan, right? The same Netflix that has been pushing this degrading, disgusting content for years, like Shameless, like the what's that one? There's one that I'm trying to think of that's like, it's been described to people who watch it, or by people who watch it, to me as basically softcore lesbian pornography, but I can't remember the name. Orange is the New Black, that's what it's called. Pushing racist propaganda, also like Dear White People, so on and so forth. It really doesn't matter, right? Because you get the idea. This evil organization that is Netflix. Well, Pope Francis has decided, well, you're actually going to have to give them money in order to watch the docuseries of my book and support them. Because who cares if they hail Satan? Who cares if they push pedophile propaganda? Who cares if they actually fan the flames of racial conflict? And of course, this is on top of the fact that, like I was just talking about, that Francis is indeed, or somebody at least, with apparently Francis's consent, is going around using the papal Instagram account to like sexualized depictions of girls, the self-degradation of girls, right? And I guess the thing I have to say, and this is why I said I'd get to the Taylor Marshall thing later, to people like Taylor Marshall, like Matt Walsh, right, like Cardinal Joseph Zen, etc. To all of you Catholics who sit here and say, no, I cannot support this. This is evil. This is anti-Christ. My Lord will not let me. What would it take for you to understand that that body has nothing to do with the book you revere or the God that you worship? They are a completely separate organization. Catholicism is the religion of the papacy. It's the religion of Rome. It claims, though this is not true, to be the religion of the Apostle Peter, not of Jesus Christ. And again, I don't want to get too theological because this is a watchdog. However, I just wanted to point that out and throw that out. And the last thing that we're going to talk about before we get into the articles, I wanted to say publicly, as somebody who has been an aggressive Donald Trump critic for the last 4 years, very much so. I have criticized the Masonic stature that he is held in by a lot of his fans. I have criticized his debaucherous lifestyle. I have considered him to be a perfect mirror of the liberal left that hates him and indeed of the United States itself. And there's numerous other things that you can find on this channel where I harshly criticize Donald Trump, his foreign policy, his capitulation to dictators, what he did with the Native Americans. I got a lot of words to say about the man. However, recently I have been reconsidering a couple things. And while I stand by every criticism that I have ever made of President Donald Trump, in the event that he is indeed ousted this January, I would like to say publicly that there are numerous things that I am very thankful for that came from President Donald Trump that I don't think would have come from the overwhelming majority of Republican potential candidates. And I mean that. There's a lot of things to be grateful for. A lot of money that is no longer going to killing babies. A lot of troops that are now home. A lot of people who had jobs and prosperity where the jobs and prosperity no longer existed. And I can even tell a personal anecdote with that, where roughly a year ago, maybe a little bit over, and I'm not going to tell the exact story because I want to keep my details to myself, but I was being stupid, very, very stupid, right? And as a result, lost my job. And within a week, I had 3 different job offers, right? My choice. That's a sign of a pretty solid economy when there's so many different jobs out there, right? That you can just boom, like that. Everybody who I've ever been around who wanted to find a job, as soon as they were looking for, like seriously looking for a job, there one existed and it paid well and there was a place that they could live and the food was relatively cheap. And I know a lot of that has to do with local politics, but a lot of that has to come from the top down as well. And all of that to say, I mean, if he's back in office, I'll definitely be continuing my criticisms, and I stand by the criticisms I have made before. But from one conservative to what audience that he has, I would like to say publicly, thank you, President Donald Trump, and I salute you for your service. There are many things that you did that virtually nobody would have been willing to do, and I am incredibly thankful for those things. And of course, there's a laundry list of them. I only named a couple, but nonetheless. So, with that, let's go ahead and get to the things that we need to get to. So I'm going to go ahead and get to sharing the screen here real quick. While I'm doing that, I would like to remind the people in the audience, please do hit that like button, subscribe if you have not done so, and also share this to the different social media platforms that you are on so that we can actually get this message out to the people. I, of course, appreciate anything that you do. So Israel is going to have a 4th election in 2 years. You heard that correctly, a 4th national election in 2 years. Now that, of course, is something that may need a little bit of explanation for an American, right? The parliamentary systems of most of the world's democratic nations differ greatly from our own Republican system. Republican, not referring to the Republican Party, but to the actual system of government that we have. So to kind of make it short and simple, in a lot of these parliamentary systems, you vote for parties rather than people, right? And then each individual party gets a certain amount of the legislative branch or parliament based off of the number of votes that they actually receive. So just to make it real simple, let's say there's 100 The winning party gets 33% of the vote, so they get 33 seats. The next party gets 29% of the vote, so they get 29 seats. The next party gets 14% of the vote, so they get 14 seats, so on and so forth, right? So this creates some pretty interesting differences. Number one, you have to start forming these unity governments because it's very rare that you actually get that 51 number in our own example, but just the majority government, right? So you have to form these unity governments where you basically make deals with people who may or may not agree with you, but they agree with you at least enough to want your version of government, not the quote others, right? And so you set up these, maybe the group of 29 and the group of 14 and 3 groups of 3 all come together and you get 52. There you go. You have a majority government, right? And it makes it a little bit more difficult for one group to lord its views over the other because they have to make unity with groups that are like them but not identical to them in order to form their government in the first place, unless the populace just widely agrees on things, in which case they're going to be voting, obviously, for very similar candidates, if not the exact same parties. Now, typically in these systems, their head of government, which is not usually the head of state. The head of state is usually a more symbolic figure in these governments, like the Queen of England and the President of Israel in this example, all right? But their head of government, the one who actually operates as what we would call the head of state or the president, is typically the prime minister. And the prime minister is usually elected by this parliament and unity government after the elections have already taken place. So the people elect the government sets up a unity government, and then the legislative branch that is that unity government obviously puts forward your prime minister, right? A frequent occurrence in these governments is what they call a vote of no confidence. And you may be familiar with this if you are a big fan of the prequel series in Star Wars, or any other system really or any other show or movie really that has that sort of a thing. But there's none that comes to the top of my mind other than that. Nonetheless, where basically the government gets up and they say, I don't, or the members of the legislative get up, right? And they say, I don't have trust in this government. It's obviously not doing its job. And therefore, we need to have a new election to set up a new government, right? A big portion of the reason why this is possible is because their elections are way quicker than ours. The whole notion that you would run a year and a half in advance in a lot of these parliamentary systems is just absurd. Excuse me. But nonetheless, so you see there basically the differences that interest us here is who leads the government, what the government is made up of, and also who's going to end up being the prime minister. Excuse me. I'm going to go ahead and zoom in here. So for a fourth time now, the first 3 times because they weren't able to set up, because they weren't able to set up a unity government in the first place, and now this fourth time due to a vote of no confidence, Israel is going to have an election, right? They had an election, like I said, 3 different times over the last 2 years. This will be the 4th time in the last 2 years that they're going to be having an election. And if they do end up having an election, what am I doing? I'm zooming. That's what I'm doing. If they do end up having an election, then of course we're going to see potentially the Likud get more power, potentially less power. Maybe Benjamin Netanyahu actually gets a more solidified position as the prime minister, whereas now he would have to be trading it every year and a half. Obviously, this potentially pushes back, if he does win, Netanyahu, this potentially pushes back the potential bribery charges that come against Benjamin Netanyahu, because he does actually have immunity from being charged while he's the prime minister. So there's a lot of important things that go into this. Interestingly enough, a lot of people were saying that the star of Bethlehem was shining over the weekend. I don't know anything about astronomy, so I'm not sure if that's true. But it is interesting that was claimed, and yet here we are on Tuesday, right? Or maybe it was Monday, but nonetheless, here we are on Wednesday. I got the day wrong. And there's talk of the Pope resigning and of Israel's government being dissolved. Although the Pope resigning thing, as we're going to get into, is really not what people are making it out to be. Nonetheless, let's get into this. Israeli Parliament approves measure to dissolve unity government. This is from Daniel Uriah of UPI.com. And let's get right into this. And as you can see, this has actually been something that's been going on for a while, so I apologize for neglecting to report on this. Israel's parliament voted in favor of dissolving the coalition government, putting the country on track for a potential 4th election in 2 years. Lawmakers in the parliament known as the Knesset voted 61 to 54 to approve the preliminary reading of a bill to dissolve the parliament, the first of at least 6 steps before new elections are declared. Although, if you it's one of those things where it's like it's sort of like rolling a boulder down the hill, right? It's virtually impossible to actually stop these things after they occur. Nonetheless, following Wednesday's vote, the bill is likely to be sent to the Knesset House Committee, where Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's Likud party and the Blue and White Party, led by Defense Minister and alternate Prime Minister Benny Gantz, will enter negotiations that could prevent another vote. I personally am almost 100% assured that they won't, but of course, I am no prophet, so we'll see what happens. After 3 elections failed to produce a winner between Netanyahu and Gantz, the two factions agreed to form a unity government in April, of course, to push off the potential 4th election. Under the agreement, Netanyahu was set to remain as prime minister for 18 months, with Gantz replacing him after that. However, Gantz on Wednesday announced his party would support the bill to dissolve the government, accusing Netanyahu of attempting to prolong his time heading the government, which, let me just say quickly, I believe is a very stupid strategy. As time goes on, not only do people become less interested in Netanyahu's bribery charges, but also Netanyahu's conservative form of government does actually become more and more appealing to the people. In fact, Benny Gantz himself has become incredibly hawkish, shall we say, in order to keep up. And there's a reason for that. When the entire world seems to be against you, right? And now, when the world's, first off, when the entire world seems to be against you, you need to be very militaristic, right, and strong. But also, now the entire world seems to be coming to your aid, and yet the one nation that's been causing all this is still doing exactly what you said they did. That bolsters, or what you said they were doing, rather, which is holding out and supporting terrorists, right, these so-called Palestinians. That bolsters this right-wing claim and proves that it was true. Now, I wouldn't even have any problem with that if it wasn't for the fact that Netanyahu does seem to be using this as a means of keeping power so that he's not actually charged with bribery. And also the fact that he does seem to be at least a little bit okay with the ultra-Orthodox factions of government, which abuse Karaites, abuse Ethiopian Jews, abuse Messianic Jews, give themselves special immunity, such as the idea that Haredi Jews are somehow exempt from military service, which I think is ridiculous. But nonetheless, it's not my country, right? The point being, there is a lot of reasons to disapprove of what Netanyahu has been doing recently. But nonetheless, let's get back into this before I just rant too long and take up all of our time. Because we also, of course, do need to get to Francis. Quote, I had no illusions about Netanyahu, end quote, said Gantz. Quote, I was well aware of his track record as a serial promise breaker, but I thought that the people of Israel are more important than one leader and that Netanyahu would rise to the occasion. Much to my dismay, that didn't happen, end quote. Now, to be fair, that's not 100% true. There's a lot of good things that Netanyahu does and has constantly done. He's a little bit too quick with the COVID lockdowns, in my opinion. And obviously, there's the things I already pointed out. But Netanyahu, there's a reason the people keep electing his Likud party, right? He's kept the people safe. He's kept the economy booming. He's kept Israel in good standing with the United States. He's fought hard for Israel when it comes to fighting the entire world, whether at the United Nations or individually with each country, right? So there is a lot of good to be said about Netanyahu as well. Gantz obviously does not like Netanyahu. We get that. He has, a huge stake in this, not only considering his political career, but considering the fact that, of course, this is his country, right? The same way that we all consider ourselves to have huge stake in our own elections. On the contrary, Netanyahu said his Likud party would vote against the measure, accusing Gantz of threatening the nation's stability. I can guarantee you that is a lie. Why can I guarantee you that is a lie? Because if Netanyahu actually gets another election, Netanyahu almost guaranteed gets more votes and more power, meaning he gets a stronger hold on the prime ministership. This is just Netanyahu playing politics, in my opinion. Quote, Benny, what you need to do now is do a U-turn away from politics for the people of Israel, he said, he being Benjamin Netanyahu. And so there's that article there, right? Obviously, there's some steps that need to be taken, but when you have over half of the government saying, no, we're actually not down with this, we're going to go ahead and dissolve this government, as well as a very serious political gain to be had for the majority party, namely Likud, I think it is virtually impossible that we avoid a fourth election at this point. I obviously could be wrong. I've been wrong before, right? But I don't think I am, obviously. So take that for what it's worth. But nonetheless, just because I don't want to waste any time, I want to get right to, and I need to obviously change the heading. Will Pope Francis resign? Is what I would like to speak about now. Oh, come on. Will Pope Francis resign? Numerous different news websites, tabloids, newspapers, etc., have said that they expect Pope Francis to resign after Christmas or after the coming New Year, following in Benedict's footsteps. Now, of course, that would be incredibly interesting, considering the fact that that would mean there would be two former popes who were alive, namely Benedict XVI, who is Francis's predecessor, and then Francis. It would also mean that the 73 out of 128 cardinals who make up the current College of Cardinals and can vote, who Pope Francis also appointed, sorry, I forgot to add that part, they would be electing the next pope. And potentially it would be a younger and potentially even more radical version of Francis, right? Now, there have been other people who have been coming out saying that this is very unlikely, saying that Francis is, not likely to be resigning in any imminent time, at least, though they're leaving open the possibility that he may resign sometime in the future. And there has also been, numerous reports like this in the past, which is just something we definitely do need to know. This isn't the first time people have speculated that Francis might resign. I believe there was talk in around 2018, if I'm not mistaken, that Francis might resign. And also at the beginning of this whole COVID crisis, when he got sick, there was talk that Francis might resign. And of course, he never did in those two instances. So this could just be another instance exactly like that. Obviously, I'm getting this here from Express, which though Express can be trusted maybe 60 to 70% of the time, Express does also have a tendency to have sensationalist headlines, right? So we do need to take this story with a grain of salt is basically what I'm saying. But it's obviously something that we should be informed of, because if it does happen, we obviously don't want to be shocked, and we need to know the potential implications, such as the fact that 73, which is well over a majority, it's 64 to be a majority, right? 73 of the cardinals, the 128 cardinals who would vote in a papal election, were appointed by Francis himself. They're those pro-homosexuality, fighting the climate change, let's all destroy borders kinds of guys, super socialist kinds of guys, right? So obviously, they're, if they're going to be electing the next pope, that's incredibly important, considering how damaging Pope Francis was not only to the Catholic Church, but to the world, right? I think a lot of people only now are starting to realize in the age of Francis just how much influence the Pope actually has over geopolitical disputes. But nonetheless, with that, let's go ahead and get into the article at hand here today. This is from Express, and it says Pope could resign after Christmas as Francis vowed to follow Benedict XVI. And this is from, I'm sorry, I'm probably going to mispronounce this, but I believe that is Callum Hoare, is how you would say that. But nonetheless, we continue. By the way, real quick, I do want to give a shout out to the people who I see in the live chat. Honesty Angel, Shalom, Erica Hubner. I don't know if I said your last name correctly, but Shalom. Thank you very much for showing up here today. Mindbreaker, Shalom. Glad to have you here in the live chat. Anybody else who is here, Shalom. Very happy to have you. Please do like, please do share, please do subscribe if you have not done so. And let's get right into the article. So Pope Francis, according to this article, could step down before the end of the year, according to a source close to the Vatican, who previously speculated that the pontiff could resign in 2020. So does need to be noted then that this previous speculation at least could be a way to try and bolster claims one made in the past when it appears that they're not actually going to be coming true. right? People do this all the time. It's not necessarily dishonest. It's more of a confirmation bias, really. You're like, oh, we're getting closer and closer to the time, and I predicted this, and my prediction has to be right. That's why I predicted it, right? So, a little bit more salt to be thrown on the article, I guess. The 83-year-old became head of the Catholic Church following the resignation of Pope Benedict XVI, a controversial move, and the first of its kind in more than 500 years. However, a source close to Pope Francis claimed he would only serve for 7 years, stating he would follow in the footsteps of his predecessor. And, of course, 7 being a important number symbolically, both in just biblical tradition itself and also in the Catholic tradition. So, he may use that to some sort of, propagandistic advantage. Who knows? But I just wanted to point that out. Austin Ivere, who is the former director for public affairs of the, previous Archbishop of Westminster, Cardinal Cormac Murphy O'Connor, and continues to work closely with the Vatican. Now, that was a very poorly written sentence. And I think that what they're trying to say is that he is the source. Yeah, because they're reiterated here, down here, that he is the source. But they're explaining who the source is. So, just to reiterate that one more time for you guys, Austin Ivere is the source. He is the former director for public affairs of the Archbishop of Westminster, or previous Archbishop of Westminster, who is a Cardinal, Cormac Murphy O'Connor, and he continues to work closely with the Vatican, at least according to this source. He said in 2015, he made clear from the beginning that, quote, he regarded Pope Benedict XVI, of course, act as a prophetic act of great modesty, and he would have absolutely no problem in doing the same. So as far back as even 2015, people were talking about potentially Francis resigning, right? What was interesting was he said to Mexican television in 2014, even pushed farther back, only a year and a little bit of change, right? Because it's probably not in the beginning of the year, of his papacy. What was interesting is he said to Mexican television in 2014 that he believed he would have a short papacy of about 5 years. And of course, that did not end up happening. We are in the 7th year now, but the quote continues. What I'm hearing now from people close to him is that he's going to need 7 years to achieve his 5-year plan. And that, of course, would mean staying on until 2020, end quote. And I believe, let's see, here we are. Speaking in a lengthy television with the Mexican program, I'm not going to pronounce this correctly, I'm sorry. Noticieros Televisa, maybe? I don't know, maybe I did. Who knows? The pontiff responded to a question from journalist Valentina Alazraki, or however you say that, about the length of his papacy. He said, quote, I have the feeling that my pontificate will be brief. 4 or 5 years, I do not know. Or 2, 3. Well, 2 have already passed. It's like a little vague feeling, but I have the feeling that the Lord puts me here for a brief thing and not more, end quote. And that actually is a quote directly from Pope Francis himself. This is Benedict XVI, the former pope, who resigned in 2013. And of course, one of the things that does need to be noted here is that there has been deep religious and ideological disputes between what has been termed by outsiders the Francis camp and the Benedict camp, the traditionalist Catholics and the more progressive Catholics. And it's going to be interesting to see how that would work out if you now have not only this resigned, no longer really relevant, former pope in Benedict, who's a conservative, but also an equal to him in Francis, who would also be resigned, as well as, presumably at least, somebody who agrees with Francis in the episcopate currently being at the time that this would all happen. That would do very interesting things, I think, for the unity of the church, for the overall teachings as it pertains to papal infallibility, papal primacy, church infallibility, papal supremacy, whether or not the church has a schism itself, right? I think there's a lot of things that people would have to actually, just deeply consider at that point. And of course, if they don't, it's just going to come out like a freight train and slap them in the face regardless. But nonetheless, let's just go ahead and continue here with the article. I just wanted to point out, right, the ideological disputes between these two, and how that could be made more interesting if there is another retired pontiff, and that retired pontiff being Francis actually is holding the same positions as a current pontiff who would have the same positions presumably that Francis would. Right, it's a lot of speculation, I'll be honest, but nonetheless, continuing on the theme, Miss Al-Zaraqi, however you say that, asked the Pope, then 79, about the idea of resigning at 80, which of course he's 83 now, so that did not happen. He responded, quote, "I believe that the papacy has something of last instance. It is a special grace. I am not of the idea of putting an age on it, but I am of the idea of what Benedict did," end quote. If the comments are anything to go by, then the Pope will retire in the next 2 weeks. Potentially, of course, that's what they're saying. But he has committed to several events over the next few days during one of the most important periods of the Christian calendar, Christmas, as billions celebrate the birth of Jesus Christ. Francis will mark the occasion with the Vatican's traditional midnight mass on Christmas Eve, but will begin the liturgy at 7:30 p.m. local time so that the few people invited to attend can get home in time to observe Italy's 10 p.m. curfew. I am not sure what 7 p.m. Italy time is our time. Maybe somebody who is in the live chat can figure that out and let everybody know, but I have no idea. And the Pope's Christmas blessing, Urbi et Orbi, to the city and the world, will be given, as usual, at noon on Christmas Day from the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica. And isn't that interesting? To the city and the world. It almost sounds like it's going to have this aura of globalism, of ecumenism, of interfaith dialogue outside of the Christian faith, which there is a name for that, but I always forget it. I think it's perennialism, if I'm not mistaken. But nonetheless, we will, of course, see. Because, the 25th is 2 days away. And actually, for us, it is, I think, probably about 1.5 days away. Because I believe, I know I just said I don't know the actual time of, what Italy time is corresponding to our time. But I have to imagine it's at least 10 or 12 hours, right? So chances are we'll probably be witnessing this. I guess that would be early in the morning. If it was 12 hours, it'd have to be like a full 24 hours to be the next day. Nonetheless, I digress. Therefore, he would be left with a window of less than a week if Mr. Ivere's prediction from 2015 is anything to go by. In their announcements of his festive plans, the Pope's and of course, by Pope we mean the Arch-Blasphemous himself. Just have to throw that out there, right? I've been calling him Pope here in this, and I want to kind of mold my words to be a little bit more accurate, right? He's not a pope or a holy father or anything like that. He is the Arch-Blasphemous. It's not a pro-choice, it's pro-death, so on and so forth. So I'm trying to kind of mold my rhetoric, if you will, to be a little bit more in line with what I believe is true. But nonetheless, the next events, Francis's next event does not fall until December 31st, 2020, which is an address from St. Peter's Basilica to thank God for the past year. However, the writer has also said Pope's comments should not be taken as fact. There I am using the Pope again, right as I just said that. We'll get there. He added in 2015, quote, "He knows he is in the hands of God, and so none of this is predictable." You can look at it two ways. I mean, politically, you could say it is quite clever because he also signaling to those people who do want to see a change in the church that there isn't much time. He's putting salt on the tail of everyone saying we need to get this done, so I think you can take his plan both ways. Some of his opponents are waiting for him to go, and they will be encouraged by this. At the age of 79, and this is, of course, being 4 years ago, we are talking about here him stepping down in his 80s in the year 2020. There aren't many men, frankly, who are capable physically, let alone mentally, of leading a massive institution with all the demands that the papacy brings, end quote. And, what happened there? That's not what I wanted. Sorry about that, friends. Anyways, Man, I had a thought there that I wanted to share too, and then that went down, and now I lost my thought. That's not cool. Whatever, we'll just go back into the article. That's fine. Speaking to express.co.uk recently, Mr. Everett, said a lot had changed since he commented 5 years ago. Quote, he added, quote, Pope Francis no longer speaks of his papacy as a short papacy, and 7.5 years on from his election, it is clear he is staying on. This is a pope in full flow with a reform program that is being implemented with vigor. Next year, 2021, he will publish his new redesign of the Vatican and replace a large number of key appointees. He will also be visiting Iraq in March. Let me say that again in case you didn't catch that. Next year, in 2021, he will publish his new redesign of the Vatican and replace a large number of key appointees. He will also be visiting Iraq in March. So mark those on your calendar, my friends. Anyways, returning to the quote. In many ways, the COVID crisis has breathed new life into this pontificate. He has a clear mission now to lead humanity through this dark night into a brighter future, and thus endeth the article. So, what are we to make of this? Well, I conclude, like the article itself did conclude, that Pope Francis will not resign. I think that this is going to end up being a nothing burger. But of course, it is important to talk about because, number one, it gives us some details as to what could potentially happen in the future regardless. But also, number two, if it does end up happening, we don't want to be caught off guard, right? We want to actually be aware of the things that are going on and how they're going to impact us geopolitically and even, in a lot of instances, religiously. But I don't think Pope Francis will resign. I think that there is too much radical reform that Francis wants to make for Pope Francis to resign, frankly. Obviously, they were just talking about his redesign of the Vatican, and by which they mean replacing all of the different hierarchs in the Vatican with people who are more in line with his political ideology. But also, of course, he's going to be visiting Iraq. He'll probably be visiting Israel here soon again, as he has in the past, right? There is a lot being said about the Vatican trying to, maintain some level of ownership and custodianship over holy sites all across the world. There is, of course, the Palestinian and Israeli conflict that the Pope is very much involved in and has been for quite some time. The Pope is involved in the World Economic Forum's Great Reset, and that, of course, is being moved forward now. Why is it being moved forward now? Well, because not only do we have a lot of things that seem to be coinciding with this, like the UN denuclearization treaty, the Dominion systems, so on and so forth. Can't really say anything about that, but you know what I mean. But on top of that, the COVID crisis itself collapsing these economies, making people actually get really comfortable with the idea of UBI and the government just printing money ad hoc or ad hominem, not ad hoc. Oh my goodness, ad infinitum. Jeez, ad hoc and ad hominem. That doesn't even make any sense. Get with the program, Jay. Sorry. Ad infinitum, going on forever, right? Now, with that being said, I do think one of the most important things to take from this is that there is large dispute, uncertainty, confusion in the Vatican at this time. And a lot of people have been predicting a potential schism within the church. I am not so bold as to do that. But I do think it is possible. Potentially something more akin to an exodus, like the Protestant Reformation, right? But there are a lot of Roman Catholics out there. Joseph Zen, Cardinal Vigano, or Archbishop Vigano, whatever it is that he actually has as his title. Cardinal Burke, Timothy Marshall, or not Timothy Marshall. I'm forgetting his name. I just sent it earlier today. But Dr. Marshall, right? Obviously, politically popular Catholics, Newt Gingrich, Andrew Napolitano, Matt Walsh, etc., right? Who are starting to see the Pope kind of as a sham and the whole papal system kind of as a sham. And hopefully that will cause them to leave this body and actually come to the true faith. That's obviously something that would be my greatest hope for them, right? But nonetheless, from a just strictly sociopolitical perspective, That would obviously be very interesting for world politics, be very interesting for the history of Christianity and religion as a whole, if there was some kind of a split or schism or exodus from or whatever, the Vatican, right? In the Vatican. And I think this does kind of, the rumor does kind of give credence, to that idea that maybe we might see some sort of a crisis in the Catholic Church here soon. I don't know that for a fact. God knows. But, we'll see what happens. And really, that's all I can say, right? I mean, there's just not much else that can be said with any level of certainty. The Pope may even resign. I could be wrong about that, and so could this article, right? Who knows? Nonetheless, UN denuclearization is the last topic to discuss today. UN denuclearization is real. It is very real. It is happening soon. Here we have Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. As you can see here, General Assembly decided to convene in 2017. So this is a very, very new treaty. Although and we've actually read this before, the Treaty on the Prohibition of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. This is basically kind of a reiteration of that. This is a reiteration of the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, which was in like 1970. Man, I forget. I actually did a article where we went through that particular treaty, the one signed 50 some odd years ago. I believe it was 1970, maybe 1971. Not 100% sure. But nonetheless, they are wanting to put it into force January of 2021, which of course is right around the corner. In fact, if you really want to get technical, January itself is 9 days from now, right? And obviously it's not 9 days in total that they want to put this into effect, but it is less than a month from now, right? Which, by the way, as is potentially at least the inauguration of Joe Biden. So a lot of things to mark for your calendars, friends. We're in for a time. Put your faith in Christ and not in men, because we are in for a time. And maybe not, right? Maybe the Lord withholds judgment from this nation. I don't know, but we'll see. Nonetheless, let's just read this real quick. By treaty, or by resolution 71-258, the General Assembly decided to convene in 2017 a United Nations conference to negotiate a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons, leading toward their total elimination. The Assembly encouraged all member states to participate in the conference with the participation and contribution of international organizations and civil society representatives. Now, of course, denuclearization is a good thing. Nuclear bombs are a horrible evil that have, unfortunately, just been, they've been thrust upon us, and there's nothing we can do about it really now, right? We have this technology, but they are indeed a horrible evil. Now, does that mean that the UN government or international governments should be policing or enforcing their elimination and destruction? I don't think so. I tend to think of this along a lot of the same lines that I think about the Second Amendment, right? The idea being, if the technology exists, then it seems to me safer that more nations have it than not, because nobody wants to mess with a country that has nuclear bombs, right? Nobody seems to have a problem with picking on these small Yemen, Syria, Libya, Venezuela countries. China, Russia, the United Kingdom, France, United States. People don't tend to mess with us very much, right? Now, maybe I'm wrong about this. Maybe I'm being naive, but it does seem to me that it's better for the good guys to have the evil thing than for nobody to have the evil thing, with the bad guys potentially having the ability to get it. Because as we all know, the quote-unquote bad guys, right, they always find a way. That's kind of part of the reason that they're bad guys, right? The criminal doesn't go to his local, Cabela's or Dick's Sporting Goods and buy a rifle. That's just not how that usually works. Likewise, Iran is not usually going to be getting the nuclear material it's getting by, following all the proper protocols, right? Or North Korea for that matter, or even Israel for that matter, a country that I would support. The conference took place on the 27th to the 31st of March, and from the 15th of June to the 7th of July in New York. The conference was chaired by Ambassador Elaine Whites Gomez, permanent representative of Costa Rica to the UN office at Geneva. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons includes a comprehensive set of prohibitions on participating in any nuclear weapons activities. These include undertakings not to develop, test, produce, acquire, possess. Hang on. I read that wrong. These includes undertakings not to develop, test, produce, acquire, possess, stockpile, use, or threaten to use nuclear weapons. The treaty also prohibits the deployment of nuclear weapons on national territory and the provision for, of assistance to any state in the conduct of prohibited activities. State parties will be obliged to prevent and suppress any activity prohibited under the TPNW undertaken by persons or on territory under its jurisdiction and control. The treaty also obliges states parties to provide adequate assistance to individuals affected by the use or testing of nuclear weapons, as well as to take necessary and appropriate measures of environmental remediation in areas under its jurisdiction or control contaminated as a result of activities related to the testing or use of nuclear weapons. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons was adopted by the conference by a vote of 122 states in favor with 1 against and 1 abstention at the United Nations on July 7th, 2017, and opened for signature by the Secretary General of the United Nations, whose name is Antonio Guterres, on the 20th of September, 2017, Following the deposit with the Secretary General of the 50th Instrument of Ratification, following the deposit with the Secretary General of the 50th Instrument of Ratification or Accession of the Treaty on October 24th, 2020, it shall enter into force on January 26th, 2021, in accordance with its Article 15. Role of the United Nations. By its Resolution 72-31 of December 4th, 2017, the General Assembly requested the Secretary General to render the necessary assistance and to provide such services as may be necessary to fulfill the task entrusted to him under the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Let me say that one more time. By its Resolution 72-31 of the 4th of December, 2017, the General Assembly requested the Secretary General to render the necessary assistance and to provide such services as may be necessary to fulfill the task entrusted to him under the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Under Article 19, the Secretary General is designated as depository of the treaty. He is also tasked with the transmission of the states parties of declarations received pursuant to Article 2 of the treaty and the convening of meetings of states parties and review conferences, Article 8. Background. 1 second, I have to take a drink. I have no idea what in the world I would do without coffee. Thank the Lord for coffee. Anyways, the initiative, tea also, gotta say, for late nights, tea. The initiative to seek a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons is an outcome of the discourse centered on promoting greater awareness and understanding of the humanitarian consequences that would result from any use of nuclear weapons. In recent years, renewed interest in the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons was first manifested in the final document NPT-Conference.2010-50, Volume 1 of the 2020 Review Conference of the Parties, Review Conference of the Parties to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. Man, I talk like a drunk person. I apologize. Hope you guys can understand. In its conclusions and recommendations for follow-on actions, the conference expressed its deep concerns on the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons and reaffirmed the need for all states at all times to comply with applicable international law, including international humanitarian law. And of course, for me, this is kind of a weird thing because it's not that I disagree. I mean, nuclear bombs, like I said, they're horrifying. They're literally apocalyptic. And obviously, a lot of the international laws that have been passed and ratified by the United Nations are good laws. The thing is the United Nations doesn't have any authority, in my opinion. International governance has absolutely, positively no authority whatsoever, in my personal opinion. They are not legitimate rulers. They are nothing more than people with their own little agendas trying to push forward their own national agendas and trying to get other nations to support them or be subjugated to them whilst doing it. It's a joke, frankly. The idea that we even could have global governance, in my opinion, is a joke, though I do unfortunately believe there are very many liberals, socialists, neoconservatives, and numerous other political ideologies, who do actually want to push forward some kind of a new world order, some kind of a global governance, some sort of a international law that is legally binding, right? But at least as it stands now, and as it will always stand from the philosophical perspective and from the moral perspective, I do not believe international governments actually have any legitimate authority. I believe in the sovereignty of the state, right? In fact, when it comes to our own nation, I even believe in the sovereignty of the individual state, right? Firm supporter of states' rights, as is clearly articulated in the 10th Amendment of the Constitution and was very obviously understood by the Founding Fathers to mean anything outside of the Constitution is mitigated to the states or the people, but I digress, right? I don't like this idea of making a bigger and bigger and bigger tent for, from which to govern, right? I want localization. And really anybody who appreciates freedom, who appreciates their cultural traditions, who appreciates their people, who appreciates their way of life, who appreciates their local prosperity, anybody here who is, agreeing with any of these things, you should also agree with what I am saying, with the sovereignty of states, with the localization of government, right? Sovereignty of nation states, I mean, right? Because I know a lot of my listeners aren't necessarily going to be in the United States. Surprisingly enough, actually, it always blows my mind that I have people who listen and aren't in the United States. Although I know the majority of them are. Not the point, right? I mean, this is a big deal. This is a really big deal. And by the way, it's a big deal for everybody. If California wants to have its socialist utopia that it claims it can actually set up, but the globalists, hypothetically speaking, want to set up some sort of global monarchy, right? Obviously, that comes into conflict with what California wants and with California's sovereignty as a province, because that's really what the United States states are, right? To govern itself. If we want to set up a monarchy and we want a republic here in the United States, then that obviously is coming into conflict with the sovereignty of the nation to govern itself, so on and so forth. Frankly, nationalism is the only moral opinion in this regard. And nationalism does not mean racism. It is not ethnocentrism. It is not anti-immigrant rhetoric. There are bad nationalists just as there are good nationalists, right? You could even word it a different way. There are chauvinists, you're bad nationalists, just as much as there are patriots, you're good nationalists. But nationalism is a good thing. You should want the preservation of your culture. You should want the preservation of your traditions. You should want your people to thrive and to be prosperous. That doesn't mean you have to hate other people. That doesn't mean you have to say other people can't come here. That doesn't mean you have to say other people can't even become part of my people and celebrate their heritage. We did that for quite some time. It does, however, mean that you have a deep respect, a deep reverence for your nation, for your people, for your flag, right? For the history that makes up you. Not a worship, right? We have one God. Not a blind loyalty. The government is very corrupt. But a respect for the nation, for the values, for the culture, for the heritage. And in this particular case, for your sovereignty. But my rant about nationalism aside, let's get back to the denuclearization treaty. In 2012, expressing concern about the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons, the General Assembly adopted resolution 67-56 entitled, quote, taking forward multilateral nuclear disarmament negotiations, end quote. By this resolution, the Assembly established in 2013, same year Pope Francis happened to be elected, by the way, an open-ended working group to develop proposals to take forward multilateral nuclear disarmament negotiations for the achievement and maintenance of a world without nuclear weapons, and the open-ended working group reflected its discussions in its report. A series of 3 international conferences on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons, convened in 2013 and 2014, respectively, in Norway, Mexico, and Austria, sought to present a facts-based understanding of the short and long-term effects of a nuclear weapon detonation. These conferences, which included participation by a large majority of states, the International Committee of the Red Cross, and hundreds of representatives of non-governmental organizations, principally coordinated by the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, or ICAN, played an important role in building demand for urgent action to advance nuclear disarmament negotiations, which is just, to of course point out that this has been going on for quite some time. In recent years, renewed interest in the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons was first manifested in the final document NPT-Conference 2010-50 Volume 1 of the 2010 Review Conference of the Parties to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. In its conclusions and recommendations for the follow-on actions, the conference expressed its deep concern at the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons and reaffirmed the need for all states at all times to comply with applicable international law, including international humanitarian law. I know I've already read that, but I just wanted to express it again, because I think it is an important thing for us all to note. And I'm going to skip over the other paragraph that I just read, just because I want everybody to be aware of everything that's going on here. A series of three man, you ever have those moments where your tongue just kind of rolls over in your mouth and you don't actually vocalize the sound that you made in your head, but your brain just kind of quits? That just happened to me. But nonetheless, a series of three international conferences on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons convened in 2013 and 2014, respectively. I already looked at that. I think this just repeated itself, this article. Yeah, it just sort of repeated itself. Okay, that's fine. So we don't need to read the rest of this. And these are the General Assembly resolutions that have been obviously taken for prohibition of nuclear weapons. See here, taking forward nuclear disarmament negotiations. Hopefully, we will have the time at some point to go through every single one of these word for word. And I'm 100% serious about that. I know that sounds boring, but that is a huge portion of what we do here on the Watchdog, is going through these things word for word, right? I understand that I have my own bias, my own agenda. This is obviously punditry and theory and science and all that stuff, right? Just like any other journalistic podcast or show would be. But what is going to differentiate this program from these other programs, even though it might make these shows a little boring, is we are reading the documents to you so that you can see them for yourself, right? Whether it's Pope Francis's message to the Chinese Catholics, whether it's the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, whether it's the Abraham Accords, right? That's what we're going to be doing here, is making sure that you know every single word that is actually present, because that is what is important. You ever heard the phrase, read the fine print? Well, there's a reason it always comes from a lawyer, right? And I know a lot of times it's impossible to even do that, right? There's 5,600 words, for example, in the recent bill that our own Congress just passed. Or 5,600 pages, excuse me. But, for those things which we can read in full, we will read in full. And, at some point I might even find a way to publish the bill on like a website or something if I can get that up. But nonetheless, mark your calendars, friends, for January the 22nd, 2021. That is when the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons does go into effect, at least allegedly. We will see what happens. Who knows, right? Only God knows. That is a genuine fact. Only God knows. And whether or not this ends up being the beginning of true local governance, or, maybe it just ends up being another nothing burger. A lot of times what we do end up seeing when it comes to, the United Nations or any of these international bodies is they just kind of say stuff and then nothing actually happens, right? So maybe it's something like that. We'll see. But nonetheless, mark your calendar for January 22nd of 2021, because that is when that is supposed to go in effect. And of course, that is right around inauguration time. I believe inauguration is the 24th, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe somebody can correct me there in the excuse me, in the live chat. But with that said, my friends, we're finished with this particular podcast today. So if you enjoyed this, please remember to hit that like button. Please remember to share this video. Please remember to subscribe to this YouTube channel. We actually do post Watchdogs, at least if everything is going consistently, every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. That's the goal, as well as Unapologetics, my apologetics program, not political, on Saturdays and Sundays. And of course, we do aim on making this a career. I should say. I'm still in the habit of saying we because I had people present with me when I first started this, but they have since left. This is just my channel at this point, so I apologize for that. Nonetheless, I do plan on making this a career and putting much more content, not only of the podcasts I already have, but also of history, going into philosophy, things like that, right? I do plan on making this an overall career. And if you actually would like to see that happen, I would also like to recommend not only the subscription, hitting that bell, following me on all my different social media, but please do consider going to patreon.com and looking me up at the Synagogue. That's where you'll be able to find the way to contribute to me. And of course, I greatly appreciate anything there. Questions, comments, criticisms, and concerns will be can be dropped rather in the comment section below. Obviously, any support you guys have, whether that is financial or just the like or just the view, is greatly appreciated. There is links. I actually put them in beforehand, so you can go read all the articles. There is links in the description to all of the different articles we used today. And yeah, that's about all I got as far as that is concerned. Thank you guys very much for being here. But I do have a question for you. In the face of Armageddon, will you compromise?